The axle had snapped clean through, and not one soul had stopped to help her. Ruby Lawson stood at the side of the Nevada trail with her hands balled into fists at her sides, watching the distant cloud of dust from the latest rider who had galloped past her without so much as a backward glance. Her wagon sat at an ugly tilt, the right rear wheel splayed out at a broken angle, the iron rim half buried in the red dirt as if the earth itself was trying to swallow what remained of her life's belongings. The afternoon sun pressed down on her like a brand, hot and unforgiving, and she had counted 11 riders in the last 3 hours. 11 men on horseback, 11 chances for a decent human being to show himself, and 11 profound disappointments. She had called out to the first 3. She had waved her arms at the next 4. After that, she had simply stood and watched, because there was something in a woman's pride that could only take so much public begging before it calcified into something harder and colder and altogether more dangerous. Her water supply was down to a single canteen. The nearest town, Redemption Creek, was 7 miles east. She had a 6-year-old mule named Absalom, who was currently eating tumbleweed with the cheerful indifference of an animal that had long since stopped caring about human suffering. And she had a crate of medical supplies, 2 trunks of clothing, a hand-stitched quilt her mother had made before she died, and $63 hidden in the lining of her left boot. What she did not have was anyone who cared whether she lived or died out here on this stretch of open trail, and that particular truth sat in her chest like a stone she had been carrying for the better part of a year. She had not always been alone. That was the cruelest part of the whole arrangement. 8 months ago, in the spring of 1882, Ruby Lawson had been the wife of Thomas Lawson of Abilene, Kansas, a man she had married at 19 after a 2-year courtship that had seemed, at the time, to be everything a young woman from a modest farming family could reasonably hope for. Thomas had been handsome in a broad-shouldered, sun-weathered way. He had made her laugh in the early years. He had held her hand at her mother's funeral and told her that she would never face anything alone again so long as he had breath in his body. He had lied about that last part, as it turned out, along with a considerable number of other things. The betrayal had not come all at once. Betrayal rarely does. It had crept up on her the way a cold season creeps, imperceptible on any individual day until you suddenly wake up one morning and realize that everything green has turned to brown, and you cannot remember exactly when it happened. Thomas had begun spending nights in town, then entire weekends. He had started locking the desk in his study, the one where he kept the household accounts, and when Ruby had asked him about the declining sums in the ledger he kept at the bank, he had smiled at her with that particular brand of patient condescension that she had only recently learned to identify as the expression of a man who thought his wife was too simple to discover the truth. She had discovered the truth in the end, because the truth is rarely as well hidden as the people hiding it believe. She had found the letters from a woman in Dodge City, letters that made clear Thomas had been maintaining a second life of spectacular comprehensiveness for at least 3 of their 4 years of marriage. She had found, behind those letters, evidence that he had been siphoning money from the household accounts and funneling it toward a business venture in Nevada territory that he had never mentioned to her. She had found, buried deepest of all and hardest to look at, a document that suggested Thomas Lawson had borrowed money against the deed to their home using her forged signature. Ruby had sat at that desk for a long time after those discoveries, not crying, not screaming, just sitting very still in the way that people sit when the architecture of their entire understanding of their own life is silently collapsing around them. Then she had stood up, gone upstairs, packed 2 trunks and a crate, taken every coin she could find in the house, hitched Absalom to the wagon and driven west. She had not left a note. She had not told anyone where she was going. She had simply exercised the only freedom that remained to her, which was the freedom to remove herself from a situation that was slowly destroying whatever she had left of herself. Thomas had not come after her. She had half expected him to, had spent the first 2 weeks of the journey watching the road behind her with a combination of dread and something shamefully close to hope. He had not come. That absence was its own particular species of wound, and she carried it alongside the anger and the humiliation without examining it too closely, because some wounds, if you probe them at the wrong time, will simply bleed you dry. She was 24 years old. She was alone in the Nevada desert with a broken wagon and a mule that was eating tumbleweed, and another rider had just appeared on the western horizon. Ruby squared her shoulders. She was not going to wave her arms. She was not going to call out. She was going to stand here with whatever dignity she had left and see what kind of man this one was. She watched him come. He was still far enough away to be a silhouette, and then far enough to be a shape with details, and then close enough that she could make out the color of his horse, which was a gray roan, and the set of his shoulders, which were wide, and the pace at which he was traveling, which was a steady lope that spoke of a man who was covering distance deliberately rather than fleeing from something or racing toward something. He had a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He wore a dark coat that had seen considerable use. At his hip, plainly visible even from a distance, was a holstered revolver of the kind that serious men carried not for show, but because their profession or their history had made it a necessity. Ruby watched him, and she did not move, and she did not ask for anything. She watched him slow. She watched him stop. She watched, with a complicated mixture of emotions she could not have named in that moment, as the rider swung down from his horse with the fluid ease of a man who had spent most of his life in a saddle, and stood in the road and looked at her wagon and looked at her, and then walked toward her without being asked. "That axle is broken clean through," he said. His voice was low and direct, not a question, not a greeting, just an assessment. "I am aware of that," Ruby said. He crouched beside the wheel without another word and studied the damage with the focused attention of a man who knew what he was looking at. He was younger than she had expected from a distance. She put him at perhaps 28 or 29, with a face that had been shaped by weather and something else, something interior, something that had nothing to do with sun and wind and everything to do with decisions made in dark places. His jaw was set at an angle that suggested he rarely smiled, but the lines around his eyes when he squinted at the wheel suggested that when he did, it reached all the way up. "You have any spare timber," he said. "In the wagon bed, a short plank." He stood and went to the wagon bed and located the plank without asking her where it was, as if finding things in unexpected places was simply a skill he had developed. He came back with the plank and a look at the wheel that was almost clinical. "I can fix this," he said. "It will not be permanent. It will hold until Redemption Creek." Ruby looked at him for a moment. "Why?" she said. He looked up at her. His eyes were a very dark shade of brown, nearly black in the hard afternoon light, and they were the eyes of a man who was accustomed to people not asking him direct questions. "Why what? Why are you stopping? 11 riders passed me in the last 3 hours, I counted." Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, not pity either. Something quieter and more complicated. 11 riders are not me," he said, and went back to work on the wheel. His name was John Donnelly. She did not learn this immediately. She learned it the way you learn things from a man like him, in pieces, offered reluctantly and in no particular order, each one feeling like something that had been decided upon carefully before being surrendered. He introduced himself while he was working without looking up, in the same tone he had used to identify the broken axle. "John Donnelly," he said. "In case you're wondering who's working on your wheel." "Ruby Lawson," she said. "In case you're wondering whose wheel you're working on." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, and then apparently thought better of it. He worked steadily, and without asking her for anything except to hand him a wrench from the toolbox when he needed it. And she handed it to him, because there was something in watching a capable man do a necessary thing, competently, that made it easy to help. Not because she needed to, but because not helping would have felt like a deliberate and petty refusal. He worked for the better part of 45 minutes. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Ruby watched him work and thought about asking him more questions and then did not, because she had already asked the important one and his answer had been sufficient for now. When he was done, he stood and wiped his hands on a cloth he had produced from his coat pocket, a gesture so ordinary in the context of extraordinary circumstances that it struck her as almost tender. "That will hold," he said. "Drive slowly and keep to the smoothest part of the trail. You will need a proper smith in Redemption Creek." "I know," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, the kind of nod that does not invite further conversation, and moved toward his horse. And Ruby, who had spent 3 hours swallowing her pride in great bitter mouthfuls, who had decided that the next time a stranger helped her she would accept it quietly and with dignity, found herself saying, "Where are you headed?" He paused at his horse's shoulder. "East," he said. "Redemption Creek is east," she said. There was a silence of perhaps 5 seconds, which in the open desert felt considerably longer. "It is," he said. "I would not mind company on the road," she said. "If you are not in a hurry." He looked at her, and the calculation behind his eyes was not cold exactly, but it was deliberate in the way that self-protective people are deliberate when offered something that might be either genuine or a trap. Ruby had known that look on her own face from the inside. "I am not in a hurry," he said finally, and mounted his horse and fell in beside her wagon. They drove east as the sun went down. Redemption Creek announced itself with lights before it announced itself with buildings, a scatter of warm yellow glow against the growing dark that looked, from a distance, like something almost welcoming. Ruby had arrived in enough western towns over the past 8 months to know that welcoming and hospitable were not the same thing, and she managed her expectations accordingly. She drove carefully, as John Donnelly had instructed, keeping to the smoothest ruts in the road and listening for any worrying sounds from the repaired wheel. It held. She felt a quiet gratitude for that, separate from the larger, more complicated gratitude she was not quite ready to examine directly. John rode beside her in silence for most of those 7 miles, which would have been uncomfortable with most people, but was somehow not with him. He had the quality, rare in her experience, of not filling silence with noise simply because silence existed. He scanned the road and the surroundings with regular, unhurried attention, not the nervous vigilance of a frightened man, but the habitual alertness of one who had learned, at some cost, to remain aware of his surroundings. She found herself curious about what had taught him that, and filed the question away for later. At the edge of town, where the buildings began and the oil lamps in the windows cast moving shadows onto the street, he said, "Do you have a place to stay?" "I will find one," she said. "The Larimer house is decent," he said. "Mrs. Garfield, who runs it, does not tolerate trouble. If you tell her Donnelly sent you, she will give you a fair rate." Ruby glanced at him. "You have been here before." "Once or twice." They were passing the entrance to the main street now, and the town was alive in the way western towns came alive at night, loud and golden and smelling of horses and wood smoke, and the particular combination of whiskey and sawdust that characterized virtually every saloon between Missouri and California. Men moved on the boardwalks, and a few women and dogs, and a buckboard loaded with supplies was making slow progress toward the mercantile. "The livery is at the end of the street," John said. "Your mule will need water and feed." "I know how to care for a mule," she said, perhaps more sharply than she intended. He did not react to the sharpness, which was either very disciplined or indicated that he had developed a thick skin in situations that required one. "I know," he said. "I was offering to see to it for you while you get settled." Ruby was quiet for a moment. "I am not accustomed to people offering things without expecting something in return," she said, and the honesty of that statement, which she had not planned to offer, sat in the air between them. John was quiet too for a moment. "I am not offering anything except to water a mule," he said. "It does not require a corresponding debt." She looked at him properly then, turned on the wagon seat and looked at his face in the lamplight of the town, and what she saw there was something that surprised her. Not pity, not the studied gallantry of a man performing kindness for an audience. Something quieter, something that looked, from the outside, like simple recognition. Like one person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time recognizing another. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words came out differently than they had on the road. Softer, more real. They arranged themselves. Ruby took the wagon to the blacksmith, whose name was Pete Harrow, a large and largely silent man who examined the repair John had made with the expression of a craftsman evaluating another craftsman's work, and grunted what she chose to interpret as approval. He would have the wheel properly repaired by morning. She paid him from the money in her boot, keeping careful track of what remained. She found the Larimer house and Mrs. Garfield, who was precisely as John had described. A short, square, capable woman in her 50s who took in her wet and dusty and visibly exhausted guest with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen every variety of difficulty arrive at her door, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. The room she gave Ruby was small and clean, and had a window that looked out onto the back lot, and the bed was the first genuinely comfortable surface Ruby had encountered in longer than she wanted to think about. She sat on the edge of it in the quiet and let herself, just for a moment, feel how tired she was. Not just the road tired of 7 miles with a broken wheel, but the deeper tired that had been building for months, the tired that came from holding yourself together by sheer force of will over distances, and through difficulties that you had never expected to face alone. She pressed her hands flat on the quilt and breathed. Outside, Redemption Creek went about its noisy evening business, and somewhere in the town John Donnelly was watering her mule, and she did not know what to do with any of it. She washed her face in the basin on the dresser, and changed her dress, and went downstairs to the small dining room where Mrs. Garfield served a supper of beans and salt pork and biscuits that tasted, in Ruby's current state, like the finest meal she had encountered since leaving Abilene. She ate alone at first, and then, when she was halfway through the biscuits, the door opened and John Donnelly came in. He had cleaned up somewhat, removed his coat, and in shirt sleeves he looked less like the particular species of Western legend that the coat and the gun had implied, and more like a man, just a man, one who was tired and hungry and had spent the day on horseback and had chosen, for reasons she still did not fully understand, to spend some of that day fixing a stranger's wheel. He saw her and paused at the door with the same assessing quality he seemed to apply to most situations, and she indicated the empty chair across from her with a slight lift of her chin, an invitation that did not commit either of them to anything, and he came and sat down. Mrs. Garfield brought him the same supper without being asked, which suggested that he had in fact been here before and that she knew what he ate, and Ruby filed that away as well. They ate in the comfortable, slightly charged silence of two people who are aware that they are now doing something social rather than merely practical, and after a while Ruby said, "What brings you to Redemption Creek?" He looked up from his plate. "Business," he said. "What kind of business?" The pause was brief but perceptible. "The kind that brings a man with a gun to a town at the edge of nowhere," he said, with a flatness that was not an invitation to pursue the subject. Ruby, who had spent 4 years of her marriage not pursuing subjects that were left flat and uninviting, had developed a certain comfort with exactly that kind of response. Not comfort in the sense of accepting it, but comfort in the sense of recognizing it for what it was. "That covers a lot of territory," she observed. "It does," he agreed. "Are you a lawman?" "No. Are you the other kind?" His eyes met hers, and there was something in them that was almost amused and also almost resigned, as if he had been asked this question many times and had developed a complicated relationship with the answer. "The other kind of what?" he said carefully. "The kind who carries a gun as a profession," she said, "for hire." He was quiet for a moment, turning his fork over once in his fingers. "There are different ways to answer that," he said. "I would prefer the true one," she said. Another pause. "Then I have carried a gun for wages," he said. "I have also carried it for other reasons. What I am doing in Redemption Creek is the other reasons kind." Ruby considered that. She was aware that she was pressing a man she had known for a matter of hours on subjects that were clearly sensitive, and also aware that the reason she was pressing was not mere curiosity, but something more urgent: the need to know who she had let walk beside her wagon into a strange town. The need to know whether the instinct that had made her say yes when he had offered company on the road was a trustworthy instinct, or one of those comfortable feeling instincts that had gotten her into Thomas Lawson in the first place. "Are you dangerous?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "To some people," he said. "Not to you." "How am I supposed to know that?" "You are supposed to decide for yourself," he said. "I cannot decide it for you." That was, she thought, a very honest answer. Possibly the most honest answer anyone had given her to any question in quite some time. She picked up her biscuit and finished it. "Where are you going?" he said, and the fact that he was asking now after all her questions felt like a kind of exchange, a fairness. "I have not decided entirely," she said. "West. There is a town called Silver Falls 3 days further on where I have been told there is a need for a nurse or a midwife. I have some training." "Who told you that?" "A woman I met in Elko," she said. "She had come from there. She said they had lost their only doctor 6 months ago to a fever and had not been able to replace him." John nodded slowly. "That would be Dr. Marcus," he said. "I heard something about that." Ruby looked at him with fresh attention. "You know of Silver Falls?" "I know of most places in this part of the territory," he said. It was not boastful, just factual. "It is a rough town," he added, with a caution in his voice that was not quite a warning but was adjacent to one. "Most towns are rough," Ruby said. "That has not stopped me so far." He studied her face for a moment, and she bore the examination without looking away. "No," he said quietly, "I do not suppose it has." After supper, on the porch of the Larimer house, in the cooling night air that smelled of sage and distant rain, they sat in 2 chairs and watched the street and talked in the tentative, carefully edited way of two people who are circling something real without being ready to land on it directly. Ruby told him about Kansas. Not about Thomas, not yet, but about the life before, the farm, her mother, the way the plains looked in early morning light. He listened with the complete attention of a man who was genuinely interested, which was itself notable enough to register. He told her, in return, that he was from Texas originally, from a town south of San Antonio that she had not heard of. That he had come north at 21 after a complication that he described only as a falling out, and that she did not press him on. That he had spent 7 years moving between Nevada, Utah, and Arizona territory, taking work where he could find it, building a reputation that he clearly felt ambivalent about. He was 29. He had no family that he was in regular contact with. He had a horse named Calico and a Colt single-action Army revolver that he had carried since he was 23, and he maintained both with a meticulous care that suggested they were the things in his life most reliably within his control. "What is the business in Redemption Creek?" Ruby said when they had been talking for perhaps an hour and something had shifted between them. Some increment of trust accumulated through the ordinary commerce of stories shared. "You do not have to tell me," she added, because she believed in offering exits, having not always been offered them herself. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might take the exit. Then he said, "There is a man here who owes a debt to a family I know. Not a money debt, the other kind." "What did he do?" "He burned a ranch," John said, in a voice that had gone very level. "The family got out. Their hands did not all get out." Ruby felt the weight of that settle. "And you are here to do what exactly?" she said. "Make sure he answers for it," John said. "Through the law if possible. The sheriff here is a reasonable man, I am told. I am hoping for possible. And if it is not possible," his jaw tightened slightly. "I am hoping for possible," he said again. And the repetition was its own kind of answer, and also its own kind of restraint. and she recognized in it the portrait of a man who was genuinely trying to be something better than the darkest version of what he could be. She went to bed that night with a head full of John Donnelly and woke the next morning with him still there, occupying some portion of her mind with the comfortable insistence of a thing that has decided to take up residence. She collected her wagon from Pete Harrow after breakfast, properly repaired now, the wheels sound and the axle straight, and paid the remainder of what was owed. She loaded her trunks back in and checked on Absalom, who looked considerably better for a night of proper feed and water, and was now regarding the world with something approaching his former indifference. She was preparing to leave, calculating the road ahead and what she would need when John appeared on the street. He was in his coat again, which meant he had his gun, which meant he was thinking about his business here, and there was a focused quality to him that had not been present the night before on the porch. "You are leaving this morning," he said. "I was planning to," she said. "Is the road to Silver Falls passable this time of year?" "Mostly," he said. "There is one stretch through the high country that can be difficult if the weather turns, but this time of year you should be clear." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her wagon, at her mule, at the road. "I will be done here in a day or two," he said. She understood what he was not quite saying. "Silver Falls is east," she offered. "More or less." "More or less," he agreed. She gathered her reins. "I will be at the Hennessy Hotel in Silver Falls," she said. "According to the woman in Elko, it is the only hotel if you find yourself in that direction." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was not quite readable, which she was beginning to understand was his natural state, a man who kept his interior life at a carefully maintained distance from the surface. But in the look there was something warmer than assessment. Something that was almost, under very controlled conditions, hope. "I will find myself in that direction," he said. She drove out of Redemption Creek into a morning that was bright and clean, and full of the particular promise that western mornings carry, the sense that the world is large and the road is open, and something unknown but not necessarily bad is waiting somewhere ahead. Absalom walked at his characteristic steady pace, unconcerned with either the past or the future, which Ruby thought was probably the healthiest attitude she had encountered in her recent experience. The road to Silver Falls was 3 days, and she made the first day without incident, camping that night beside a creek that ran clear over white stones and reflected the stars with such precision that lying on her back looking up at it, she could not immediately have told you which direction was sky and which was water. She ate salt pork and hardtack and drank coffee and listened to the desert quiet, which was not silence exactly but a kind of layered stillness, insects and wind, and the distant complaint of something wild moving in the scrub, all of it threaded through with the sound of the creek. She thought about John Donnelly with the specific quality of thought she had not applied to another person in quite some time, not since the early days with Thomas when he had still been the person she had believed him to be. This was different from that, she was careful to note. She was not constructing a story about who John Donnelly was. She was attending to who he actually appeared to be, which was a discipline she had been forced to develop the hard way, through the specific education of having built a whole marriage on a story that turned out to be fiction. What she had seen of him, actually seen, was a man who stopped when others did not. A man who fixed what was broken without being asked for gratitude. A man who told her that her safety was her own decision to make rather than a gift he could simply declare. A man who was in Redemption Creek for the sake of a family he was not related to, because the law did not always move fast enough, and he had the means and the conscience to move faster. A man who ate beans and biscuits with Mrs. Garfield in a modest boarding house and spoke of his history without decoration. This was not a completed portrait, she was aware of that. But it was enough of a portrait to explain why she was sitting by a creek in the Nevada night thinking about him, and she decided to be honest with herself about that rather than dress it up as something more neutral than it was. The second day of the road was harder. The trail climbed into the high country John had mentioned, a series of switchbacks up a rocky face that required all of her attention and most of Absalom's goodwill to navigate safely. The wagon groaned on the steepest grades, and she stopped twice to let the mule rest. Looking back over the way she had come at a landscape so vast and open, it made her feel simultaneously very small and oddly free. She was coming down the far side of the pass in the late afternoon of the second day when she encountered the problem. 3 men were camped at the base of the descent, at a wide flat spot where a stream crossed the road, and they had positioned themselves in a way that was not accidental. They were dressed in range clothes, dusty and sun-faded, and one of them had a rifle leaning against his saddle that he had not made any particular effort to conceal. When she pulled up, they were already standing, watching her come down the switchbacks, and something in the arrangement of their bodies, casual but specifically distributed across the road, made her stomach tighten. "Well, hello there, miss," said the one in the middle, a man with a reddish beard and eyes that were doing a thorough and unpleasant inventory of her situation. "Where are you headed?" "Silver Falls," she said, and kept her voice level. "Alone," said the one on the left. "Not your business," she said. "If you will move aside, I will let you get on with your afternoon." Redbeard smiled in a way that had nothing warm in it. "We were thinking maybe you might have some supplies you could share," he said. "Travelers helping travelers and all of that." Ruby had her hand on the wagon seat near the small wooden box where she kept, along with other things, the Smith & Wesson Model 3 revolver that she had acquired in Elko and had practiced with twice on that open stretch of Nevada desert where there was nothing for miles that she could hit except things that did not matter. She was not a marksman by any serious definition of the term, but she was also not entirely without options. "I have enough supplies for myself," she said. "Good day to you." Redbeard took a step toward the wagon. The one with the rifle picked it up, not pointing it, but holding it in a way that was a statement of position. Ruby's heart was going hard in her chest, but her hand was steady on the box lid. Then there was a sound from behind her, on the road above, the sound of a single horse coming down the switchbacks at a pace that was controlled but deliberate, and all 3 men looked up, and Ruby looked in her mirror. John Donnelly came down the pass on his gray roan with the specific unhurried quality of a man who had already assessed the situation from higher ground and had decided how it was going to resolve. He rode to the flat and stopped his horse 10 feet behind Ruby's wagon, and he looked at the 3 men without any particular urgency, as if this were a mildly inconvenient delay in a generally unremarkable day. "Morning," he said, though it was afternoon. Redbeard's inventory had shifted immediately to John, and was reading the coat, the gun, the horse, the posture, the particular kind of still that very capable men have when they are not worried. The inventory was producing conclusions that were visibly affecting Redbeard's confidence. "We were just talking with the lady," he said. "I can see that," John said pleasantly. "Are you finished?" There was a silence of about 4 seconds, during which a significant amount of information was communicated without anyone speaking. Then the one with the rifle put it back against the saddle, and Redbeard stepped back off the road, and the third one moved his horse aside, and Ruby drove through the gap they made without looking at them, and John followed her through at a pace that managed to communicate, without any ostentatious display, that he was not afraid of them and had been in front of worse, and they were lucky he was feeling generous today. When they were a quarter mile beyond the stream crossing and the 3 men were behind them and the road was open again, Ruby pulled up and turned to look at him, and what she felt in that moment was complicated enough that she needed a moment to sort through it. "You were already coming," she said. "I finished my business in Redemption Creek last night," he said. "The sheriff arrested the man. It went through the law as hoped. He said it without self-congratulation, just reporting facts. I left this morning." "Thought you might be about this far," she looked at him. "You were following me." He met her look. "I was traveling in the same direction," he said carefully. "At a pace that would allow me to, yes. If you prefer, I keep my distance and travel behind." "I did not say that," Ruby said. He waited. "I am glad you were on that road," she said. I will not pretend otherwise. He nodded, and there was something in the nod that she was beginning to understand was his version of a fuller expression, an economy of outward movement that did not reflect an economy of interior life. Those men would likely have backed down regardless, he said. You had your hand on that box the whole time. She looked at him with some surprise. You saw that from the top of the pass. I see most things, he said simply. They traveled together into the falling afternoon, and the conversation that developed on that stretch of road was different from the conversations of the first evening. The survival situation had altered something, broken through a layer of careful distance, and they talked in the way that two people talk when they have been slightly afraid and are now not, which is more directly, with less filtering, with more willingness to say the thing rather than the approximation of the thing. He told her about Texas, about the falling out that had taken him north. A man had done a bad thing to his younger sister, and John had made the man pay for it in a way that was not legal, and after that leaving had seemed advisable. His sister was married now safely in San Antonio, and he had written to her but had not gone back. Would it be safe to go back? Ruby asked. To Texas. He considered that for a moment. Probably, he said. The man recovered. A pause. Mostly. She did not ask more about that. She understood that some histories had edges you could acknowledge without tracing with your finger. She told him about Thomas. Not all at once, not in a rush, but in the measured way that she had finally gotten comfortable telling it, the outline of a life that had turned out to be built on a hidden architecture, the long, slow discovery, the desk, the letters, the forged signature. She told it plainly without asking for sympathy, because she had gotten past needing sympathy and was now simply in the territory of being honest about the shape of her recent past, so that a person who was traveling beside her could see where she was coming from. He listened to all of it without interruption, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You drove west alone." "Yes," she said. "With $60 and a mule," he said, and she realized she must have mentioned the money at some point. 63, she corrected, and he did make the beginning of a laugh sound again, and this time it went further before he stopped it. "That is specific," he said. $63 is different from 60 when you are counting carefully, she said. He nodded. It is, he agreed. They camped that night at a distance from each other that was correct for the time and place and the state of their acquaintance. And in the morning they made the final push to Silver Falls on a road that descended through sage and juniper to a valley, where the town sat beside a river that ran silver in the early light, which explained the name. It was a modest town, not large, perhaps 400 souls, with a main street of roughly built businesses and a residential area of small houses that spread up the gentle slope to the east. There was a church with a white steeple, a bank, a general store, a saloon, a livery, and the Hennessy Hotel, which was exactly where the woman in Elko had said it would be. They rode in together, and Ruby was aware of being observed in the way that newcomers to small towns are always observed, the calculating assessment of a community taking in new information and deciding what to do with it. She sat straight on the wagon seat and let them look. The hotel was adequate. Better than adequate, actually, in the specific way that she had stopped expecting hotels to be. Mrs. Hennessy, who ran it along with her husband and 2 daughters, was a bright-eyed woman who managed her establishment with friendly competence and welcomed Ruby with genuine warmth when she mentioned that she was a nurse and had come about the doctor's situation. "Oh, we are so glad," Mrs. Hennessy said, and the gladness appeared to be entirely sincere. "We have been managing, but there has been need. Dr. Marcus was with us 15 years, and people do not know what to do with the gap." John took a room as well, which Ruby noticed without comment. There was a practical logic to it. He had been riding for 3 days and Calico needed rest. And it was a hotel, and he was a paying customer, and none of that needed further examination. She went the next morning to see about the situation with the doctoring, presenting herself at the town hall to the mayor, a man named Samuel Briggs, who was moderately pleased to see her and considerably less pleased when she itemized her qualifications, which were real but which did not include the formal medical degree that Silver Falls had been hoping for. She explained what she had: 3 years of training under Dr. Elizabeth Whitmore in Abilene, who had been one of the few female physicians in Kansas and had been Ruby's mentor after Ruby's mother became ill. She could manage wounds, births, fevers, bone setting in uncomplicated fractures, basic surgery for field emergencies. She was not a doctor. She was a nurse with more skill than average. Samuel Briggs looked at her and then looked at the chair across from his desk where the town's need sat invisibly but heavily, and said that perhaps they could work something out on a trial basis and see. She set up practice in a small office that had been Dr. Marcus's, which had not been touched since his death, and still smelled of the particular chemical and herbal combination that medical spaces accumulate over years. She cleaned it thoroughly. She organized what remained of his supplies and cataloged what was needed. She sent a letter to a medical supply company in San Francisco. She saw her first patient on the 3rd day of her residence in Silver Falls, a rancher's wife with an infected hand from a barbed wire cut, and treated it correctly and without incident, and word began to move through the town in the way that word moves in small communities, efficiently and with considerable embellishment. John Donnelly stayed. He did not announce this intention or make any particular point of it. He simply remained in Silver Falls while his stated reason for being in the area, his business in Redemption Creek, had been concluded. He took his meals at the hotel dining room and spent his days in ways that she gradually came to understand. He rode out each morning to various points in the surrounding country and came back by afternoon, and he did occasional work for the local ranchers who recognized the particular combination of skills he offered, and he was present in the evenings in a way that was unobtrusive but consistent. They fell into an evening habit without discussing it. After supper, which they often ate at the same table in the hotel dining room, they would sit on the hotel porch or walk the short length of the main street in the cooling evening and talk. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about books, and Ruby was surprised and pleased to discover that he had read a great deal, carried books in his saddlebag, had opinions about them that were intelligent and specific. They talked about the town, the people in it, the various dramas that small communities generate constantly. They talked about their respective pasts in the careful, progressive way of people who are sharing on a schedule, offering a little more each day, building the shared knowledge of each other like a structure you are constructing simultaneously from 2 ends, and hoping the middle will meet. One evening, 2 weeks after they had arrived in Silver Falls, sitting on the hotel porch in the last of the daylight, John said, "How long are you planning to stay?" Ruby thought about that. "As long as they need me," she said, "and as long as it suits me. Both conditions have to be true." He nodded. Then, after a pause that had a different quality from his usual pauses, "I could stay longer as well if there is work." She looked at him. The light was going gold and long, the way Nevada light went in the early evenings of that season, and it fell on his face and made him look, for a moment, less guarded than his usual. "You are asking me something," she said. "Ask me directly." His jaw tightened slightly, not with displeasure. She had learned to read that tightening. It meant he was deciding to be honest about something he was not entirely comfortable being honest about. "I would like to remain where you are," he said, "if that is something you are amenable to." The simplicity of it caught her by surprise. She had expected hedging, qualification, the elaborate protective language that people with histories like theirs tended to deploy. He had simply said the thing. "I am amenable to that," she said, and she heard in her own voice the thing she had been feeling for 2 weeks and had not yet permitted herself to name. He looked at her, and his expression did the thing she had been watching for, the thing she had been noting in stages, that reaching all the way up with the warmth. He smiled, fully, without restraint, and it was, as she had suspected from the lines around his eyes, a remarkable sight. After that, things changed and stayed the same simultaneously, which was how the best kind of change worked. They were still careful with each other, still moved with the deliberate attention of two people who had both been hurt by carelessness, and had learned to be slow and honest about important things. But there was a warmth now that was acknowledged rather than merely sensed, a willingness to sit closer on the porch bench, to let a hand rest near another hand without the pretense that this was accidental. He told her about his dark past in pieces that grew larger and more specific. There had been years when he had hired his gun without enough discretion about for whom and for what purpose, years when he had worked for men whose ends he had not examined closely enough. He was not proud of this period. He spoke of it with the flat, careful tone of someone who has made himself look at something ugly and accept that it is part of his history without permitting it to be the whole of his definition. "I cannot undo those years," he said one evening. "I have made certain choices since then that I believe were better, but I cannot offer you a clean history." "I am not asking for a clean history," Ruby said. "I am asking for an honest one." "That I can provide," he said. She told him, in return, about the deeper layers of Thomas, the things she had not been able to say in those first conversations on the road. About what it had done to her sense of herself, to discover that the life she had believed she was living had been a performance managed for her benefit while the real life went on behind it. About the specific damage that had left in her ability to trust her own perceptions. "I do not always know if I am seeing clearly," she admitted, "or if I am seeing what I want to see. Tell me when you are unsure," he said, "and I will be as clear as I can be about what is real." She looked at him. "That is a remarkable offer. It is a practical one," he said. "If you cannot trust what you are seeing, and I am one of the things you are looking at, then the most useful thing I can do is make the view as accurate as possible." She was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "That is also remarkably wise," she said. "I have made enough mistakes to accumulate a certain amount of practical wisdom," he said, and there was something in the dry way he said it that made her laugh, a real laugh, full and genuine, and the expression that crossed his face when he heard it was one she wanted to see as often as possible for as long as that was an available option. She kissed him first. She wanted to be clear about that later, to herself and to him, because it mattered to her that she had made that choice from a place of clarity and intention, rather than being swept along by circumstance. It happened one evening in late October, when the air had turned cold, and they were standing at the edge of the porch after their walk, and she had been looking at his face in the lamplight from the hotel window, and the thing she felt had arrived at a point of density that required expression. She stood up on her toes and kissed him, and he made a sound low in his throat that was surprise and was not surprise, and kissed her back with a steadiness and a tension that was entirely consistent with everything she had come to know about him. A man who, once he decided to do a thing, did it completely. When they separated, she looked at him. His dark eyes were warm in a way that she was certain most people had never seen, and that struck her as one of the great privileges of her current position. "I have been wanting to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been wanting you to," she laughed again. "You could have done it yourself," she said. "I was not certain you were ready," he said, "and it mattered that you were ready." She looked at him for a long moment and thought about Thomas, who had never once in 4 years considered whether she was ready for anything. "Yes," she said softly, "it does." November in Silver Falls turned genuinely cold, the kind of high-country cold that came with weight and intention, frost on the windows of the medical office in the mornings and ice along the edges of the river by mid-month. Ruby's practice had grown steadily. She had helped deliver 2 babies, treated a man's badly broken arm from a horse fall well enough that he regained most of his use of it, managed a near epidemic of scarlet fever in the school-age children of the town, with enough competence that Samuel Briggs had stopped saying trial basis, and had begun saying simply Dr. Lawson, which was not technically accurate but which she had stopped correcting. John had found regular work with a ranch outside town, a large spread run by a man named Cal Whitmore, no relation to her mentor, who raised cattle and required the kind of capable, trustworthy man that was not always easy to find. He rode out to the Whitmore ranch 3 days a week and came back the other days, and the rhythm of this had settled around them like something naturally occurring, the way water finds the contours of a landscape. They had conversations about the future in the same gradual, honest way they had had all their conversations. Neither of them wanted to move too fast, not because the feelings were uncertain, but because they were both people who had learned the cost of building on foundations that had not been properly examined. They were examining the foundation carefully, which was the right thing to do and was also, at certain moments on cold November evenings in front of the hotel's small parlor fire, a somewhat maddening discipline. "I need to be divorced," Ruby said one evening in November, very directly, because it was a fact that needed to be named. "I know," John said. "Thomas and I were married in Kansas. I would need to petition through the courts." "Nevada has divorce law," John said. "Simpler than most states." "You would need an attorney." She looked at him. "You have thought about this." "I have thought about what comes after this," he said. "If we are in agreement about what comes after." "We are going to have that conversation right now," she said. "I would prefer to have it right now," he said. "So we are clear about what we are doing and what we both want. I do not like ambiguity in important matters." She smiled because this was so precisely consistent with everything she knew about him. "Tell me what you want," she said. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded quality he reserved for the most serious things. "I want to stay where you are," he said. "I said that before and I meant it. I want to stay where you are permanently. I want to be married to you if you will have me. I want the kind of life that has a center that does not move." The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of everything she had felt for weeks, the warmth and the terror and the deep, careful hope of a person who had been badly hurt trying to be brave enough to let something real happen. "I want that too," she said. "I need the divorce first." "Naturally," he said. "And I want us to continue as we have been, slowly and honestly, until it is done." "Naturally," he said again. She looked at him. "You are very agreeable tonight." "I have gotten what I wanted tonight," he said. "I can afford to be agreeable." She laughed and he smiled, and the fire crackled between them. And outside, the high country winter settled around Silver Falls like a blanket pulled over a sleeping world. The divorce took 4 months. John helped her hire an attorney in Carson City, a capable man named Hendricks who handled the paperwork with brisk efficiency and cost her $40, which hurt, but was considerably less than the alternative of remaining legally bound to Thomas Lawson of Abilene, Kansas, who had, according to Mr. Hendricks's investigations, made no effort to locate his wife, and appeared to have been entirely comfortable with her departure, possibly because her departure had resolved certain logistical complications in his other life. During those 4 months, Silver Falls became home in a way that Ruby had not had a home in a long time, not since before her mother died, and the farm started to feel like a place she was waiting to leave. She knew the people by name, knew their histories and their ailments and their family dramas. She knew the particular quality of the light in each season, the way the river ran high in spring and quiet in winter, the sound the wind made coming off the mountains. She had planted a kitchen garden behind the small house she had rented from a widow woman on the residential street, small and plain and entirely hers, and she had hung her mother's quilt on the bedroom wall where she could see it from the bed. John spent most evenings at her house, and the domesticity of this was such an ordinary and profound pleasure that she sometimes stopped in the middle of something and was surprised by it. The way he sat at her kitchen table with a book in the evenings. The way he knew where she kept things and did not rearrange them. The way he listened to her when she talked about the day's patients, not just politely but genuinely, asking questions and remembering details from previous conversations. The way he laughed at her more acerbic observations about human nature, which she had been making to no available audience for most of the past year. She fell in love with him completely and without reservation, and the remarkable thing was that it did not feel reckless. It felt like the opposite of reckless. It felt like the first genuinely well-considered decision she had made in years, built on 4 months of careful examination of a foundation that was proving, under examination, to be sound. The divorce was finalized in late February of 1883, on a day that was cold and bright, the kind of high Nevada winter day that could be bitterly cold and also very beautiful. And Ruby sat in Mr. Hendrix's Carson City office and signed the final papers and felt, not triumph exactly, not relief exactly, but something that was perhaps best described as completion. A door closing on one room of her life so that she could go properly into the next one. She came back to Silver Falls on a Monday, and John was waiting at the livery when the stage pulled in, which he had managed by the simple method of asking Mrs. Hennessy when the stage from Carson City was expected and then being there at that time. He helped her down from the stage with the particular care he had always shown her that was entirely different from condescension, the care of a person who noticed things and responded to them. She showed him the papers. He read them carefully, which was typical of him. Then he looked up at her and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, more than all right. "Good," he said. And there in the dusty street outside the livery of Silver Falls, Nevada, in the cold February of 1883, with the mountains white above the town and the river running quietly in its winter pace and several residents of the town conspicuously finding reasons to be in the vicinity of the main street, John Donnelly asked her to marry him. He did not do it elaborately. He was not an elaborate man. He simply said, standing there in the street, "I would like to marry you, Ruby. If you are ready." "I am ready," she said. "I have been ready since October." He smiled the full smile again, the one she had been accumulating since the first time she had seen it on the porch of the Larimer house in Redemption Creek, and said, "Then let us not wait any longer." They were married in the Silver Falls Church on the 15th of March, 1883, on a day that had decided to be unseasonably warm as a kind of meteorological gift. The minister was a stout, kind man named Reverend Alderman, who had known Ruby through the winter, and had formed an approving opinion of her, and an only slightly more cautious, but essentially positive opinion of John. The church was full, which surprised Ruby until she understood that Silver Falls had quietly decided to claim her as one of its own, and treated her wedding accordingly. Mrs. Hennessy brought flowers, garden flowers she had kept alive through the winter in her back room for reasons she had never explained, yellow and white and entirely perfect. Cal Whitmore came from the ranch with 3 of his hands and sat in the front pew because he had, in the months of John's working for him, formed the opinion that Donnelly was the most reliable man he had ever employed and considered this event worth celebrating formally. Mrs. Garfield had come from Redemption Creek, which was remarkable and touching, and suggested that news traveled farther and faster in Nevada territory than it had any right to. Ruby wore her best dress, the blue one she had packed in a trunk in the last hours in Abilene without knowing what she was packing it for but knowing she wanted it. It was the right dress for this. She had known that when she packed it. John wore a jacket she had not seen before, which he had apparently purchased from the general store without saying anything about it, dark and well-fitted, and with his gun put away for the occasion he looked like a different version of himself and also entirely himself, both at once. The ceremony was brief and genuine. When the Reverend asked Ruby if she would have this man, she said yes with the kind of certainty that was not the absence of fear, but was the decision to move forward regardless, and it came out clear and steady and true. When the Reverend asked John if he would have this woman, John said yes with his eyes on her face, and the yes had in it all the things she had come to know about him, the careful honesty, the deliberate heart, the quality of a man who had lived through dark places and had come out of them not broken but tempered, the way steel is tempered, harder and more reliable than it was before. They walked out of the church into the warm March day as Ruby and John Donnelly, and Silver Falls cheered in the cheerful, uninhibited way of a small town that has decided to take a thing personally, and Ruby felt a happiness that was clean and unencumbered and entirely real. The spring that followed their marriage was the best season Ruby had known since the seasons before her mother had become ill, and everything had begun its slow, imperceptible darkening. She and John moved into a house rather than the rental she had been in alone, a proper house on the residential street, 2 stories and a porch, and a kitchen with a good stove, and a room at the back where she intended to have a garden that was more ambitious than the one behind the rental. John was at the Whitmore Ranch more days now, which suited him, because she had come to understand that he was a man who needed physical work to feel right in himself, who needed the engagement of a horse and open country and something tangible being accomplished. Cal Whitmore had offered him a foreman position in the spring, which he had accepted with the quiet pleasure of a man who had spent many years without a place to center himself and had found one. He came home in the evening smelling of horse and dust and wood smoke, and he washed up at the pump in the yard before he came inside, and he ate at their table and talked about the ranch and listened to her talk about her patients, and the domesticity of it was still, months in, a constant small surprise of pleasure. She expanded her medical practice in the spring, adding formal hours and a sign on the door, and wrote again to the supply company in San Francisco for equipment that had been on order since winter. She had begun corresponding with Elizabeth Whitmore back in Abilene, her old mentor, who had been delighted to receive her letter, and had responded with detailed and useful advice about managing a rural medical practice, and with warm personal happiness at Ruby's apparent change of circumstances. It was Elizabeth Whitmore's letters, partly, that sent Ruby to the realization in late May of 1883, before she had done any of the practical confirming, that she was likely with child. She had been a nurse long enough to know her own body, and she sat in the garden one morning in the week after her suspicion had formed, and let the reality of it settle around her, while the spring sun came over the eastern mountains, and the river made its constant sound, and a meadowlark called from the fence post at the garden's edge. She told John that evening. He had come home and washed at the pump and was sitting at the kitchen table with his boots off and his feet on the chair rung, reading, and she came in from the garden and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He put the book down immediately. He looked at her with the careful, full attention that was one of the things she loved most about him. He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up, crossed the kitchen, and held her face in his hands with extraordinary gentleness and said, "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be right now," she said. "I will know more as it progresses." He looked at her, and his expression was remarkable in the way that strong, controlled men's expressions can be remarkable when something has gotten through the control completely. "Ruby," he said, and that was all he said, just her name, but the way he said it contained more than most people conveyed in paragraphs. She put her hands over his. "I know," she said. Their son was born in January of 1884, in the midst of a proper Nevada winter, delivered by Ruby herself with John present, and Cal Whitmore's wife Clara serving as the additional hands that the situation required. Clara Whitmore had attended enough births on the ranch to be entirely unflappable, and she and Ruby worked with the efficient teamwork of 2 competent women who respected each other's capabilities. And John remained in the room, which Ruby had insisted on and which had required him to override some internal resistance that she recognized as coming from the era he had grown up in rather than from his own preferences. And she was glad he had stayed because the expression on his face when the baby arrived was the kind of thing a person needed to witness in order to know that they had made the absolutely right choice. They named him Thomas Edward Donnelly, and Ruby thought there might be an objection to the name Thomas given her history with the name, but she had thought about it carefully and decided that Thomas was also the name of several historical men she admired and was a perfectly good name, and she was not going to let one bad example pollute it for everyone else. And when she explained this reasoning to John, he had said that was entirely rational and they could name him whatever she liked. And that was why she loved him. Thomas Edward Donnelly was a stout and energetic baby with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined set of jaw. And he was the loudest person in Silver Falls for the first 3 months of his life, which was saying something in a town that had Cal Whitmore in it. The winter of his first months was long but not hard in the interior sense, because the house was warm and the crib was beside the bed, and John Donnelly, who had apparently not anticipated how deeply he would feel about a small person he had only just met, was so thoroughly astonished by his son that Ruby sometimes stood in the doorway of whatever room they were in together and just watched him. This man who had ridden through Nevada territory for 7 years without a center, sitting entirely still and looking at this baby, as if the center had arrived at last, and he was making sure it was real. Spring came, and Thomas Edward began to exist in a way that was more interactive and considerably more exhausting, and Ruby went back to her medical practice on partial days and full days as the spring progressed, because the town continued to need her, and she continued to need the work in the way that people who are good at something necessary need it. John had become an invaluable presence at the Whitmore Ranch, and had begun to be consulted by other ranchers in the valley as well, his reputation for reliability and capability spreading in the gradual, solid way that such reputations spread. They had a full and demanding life, which was exactly what both of them had wanted, and neither of them had quite had before. On a Saturday in the summer of 1884, 15 months after they had married, and 6 months after Thomas Edward had arrived, Ruby was in the medical office when a woman came in who turned out to be from a Paiute community 2 days east of Silver Falls, traveling with her husband who spoke enough English to translate. The woman had a wound that had not been properly treated and had begun to show signs of serious infection. Ruby worked on it for the better part of an hour, cleaning and treating and binding it, and when she was done, the woman's husband thanked her with a gravity and sincerity that she found unexpectedly moving. She thought about that visit for a long time afterward, about the injustice of the distance those people had traveled to reach basic medical care, about the fact that the communities scattered across the wide territory around Silver Falls had no more access to medicine than they had had before she arrived, and that her practice, which had been such an achievement by the standards she had set for herself, was still reaching only the fraction of people who could make it to her door. She talked to John about it, which was her habit when something was working in her head and needed the friction of another honest mind to sharpen itself. He listened carefully, asked 3 questions, and then said, "What are you thinking about doing?" "I am thinking about monthly rides," she said, "to the outlying areas, to communities that cannot come to me." "That is a significant undertaking," he said. "I know," she said. "I would need supplies and transport and occasionally someone to come with me for safety." "I can come with you," he said without hesitation. "For safety and for the lifting. You cannot lift a full medicine chest alone." She looked at him. "You would do that?" "Take the days from the ranch. Cal will manage 3 days a month without me," he said. "He has other capable people." She looked at him a moment longer. "I keep expecting you to eventually surprise me by being less than I think you are," she said, "and you keep not doing it." His expression was dry and warm at once. "That is my intention," he said. "Do not let it stop surprising you. It keeps you grateful." She laughed and threw her napkin at him, and Thomas Edward, who was in his chair at the end of the table and had been watching this exchange with the bright, uncommitted interest of a baby watching anything at all, made a sound of cheerful approval. They began the monthly medical rides in the fall of 1884, and they continued them, with some adjustments in pace when Ruby was expecting their second child, through the fall of 1885 and into 1886. The second child was a girl, born in March of 1886, and they named her Eliza Mee, after Ruby's mother, whose name had been Elizabeth, and who would have loved the name reduction and would have loved the child. Eliza Mee came into the world with considerably more efficiency than Thomas Edward had managed, and with a calm that was both reassuring and slightly uncanny in a newborn. She had her mother's red hair, of which Ruby had not previously been aware she was carrying, and John's dark eyes, and the combination was startling enough that Clara Whitmore, who was again present, said out loud that it was the most remarkable thing she had seen in years of attending ranch birthings. Thomas Edward regarded his sister with the guarded, provisional acceptance of a 2-year-old confronting something unexpected that appeared to be permanent, and by the end of the first week had formed the opinion that she was interesting, and by the end of the first month had become her devoted protector, which Ruby found simultaneously touching and exhausting to manage. The summer of 1886 was the summer Silver Falls got a proper doctor, a young man newly graduated from a medical school in Cincinnati, who arrived with modern equipment and considerable enthusiasm, and a total absence of practical experience that made Ruby briefly indispensable as a tutor, in addition to a colleague. Dr. Frank Ellison was 25 and earnest and very willing to learn from a woman a year older than himself who had been doing this work in the field for 3 years, which said well of him. She brought him along on 2 of the monthly rides before she trusted him to manage them without her, and by the fall he was doing half of them independently. She did not miss the monopoly of being the only medical person in Silver Falls. She was glad to share the burden, but she was particular about maintaining the rides to the Paiute communities and to the furthest ranches, because she had built relationships there over 2 years that Dr. Ellison had not, and because she believed those relationships were part of what made the medicine work. John Donnelly at 33 was a man who had found his shape, and the shape suited him. He was the foreman of the Whitmore Ranch and widely regarded in the valley as the most reliable man available for difficult situations, a reputation that now referred primarily to difficult cattle, or difficult weather, or difficult negotiations between ranchers, rather than to the original category of difficulty it had once described. His gun was still at his hip, habit and practicality both, but it had not been drawn in circumstances that required anything beyond demonstration for 2 years. He was also, and this was the part of his life he held most carefully, the husband of Ruby Lawson Donnelly and the father of Thomas Edward and Eliza Mee, and these facts had rearranged everything else in his interior life in the way that only the most important things can. He had written to his sister in San Antonio in the summer of 1883, telling her about the marriage. His sister, whose name was Catherine, had written back with joy that was unambiguous even through the medium of a letter, and had been writing regularly since, and the correspondence between them had rebuilt something that the years of separation had damaged. In the spring of 1886, Catherine and her husband James came to Silver Falls for a visit, the first time John and his sister had been in the same place in 12 years, and Ruby watched the reunion from a careful distance and felt, watching it, the particular happiness of seeing someone she loved given back something they had lost. Catherine was immediately devoted to both children and to Ruby, whom she assessed with the frank thoroughness of a sister, and then declared perfect for John in a way that suggested she had a list of criteria she had been maintaining for some time. "He has been waiting for someone as honest as he is," she told Ruby over coffee at the kitchen table while the men were outside and the children were asleep. "He does not tolerate anything that is not real. Most people cannot manage that. You can." "I require it as much as he does," Ruby said. "Yes," Catherine said, "that is why it works." In October of 1887, Ruby came home from the medical office in the early afternoon to find John in the kitchen, which was unusual on a weekday, and the expression on his face was one she did not immediately classify. "You are home early," she said, setting down her bag. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said. She sat down at the kitchen table. "Tell me." He sat across from her and put his hands flat on the table, a posture she recognized as the one he used when he was going to say something important and wanted to be sure it came out correctly. "Cal Whitmore is selling the ranch," he said. She felt this. "When?" "Spring. He and Clara want to go to California. Their daughter is there." He paused. "He has offered to sell me a portion of the land. The south section where the valley pasture runs along the river. Enough land to start something." Ruby looked at him. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking about a ranch," he said. "A smaller operation than Cal's, cattle primarily, some horses. It would take everything we have saved, and there would be lean years at first." He held her gaze. "I want to know what you think." She thought about the medical practice, which was established and shared and did not require her daily presence anymore. She thought about Silver Falls, which was home but whose boundaries had been expanding since she had started the monthly rides. She thought about the children, who were 3 and 1 and would grow up not remembering any other home if they moved now. She thought about John's face when he talked about the ranch, the specific quality of want in it that he had been managing carefully for long enough that she had learned to recognize its presence. "What would you call it?" she said. He looked at her carefully. "I had thought of Lawson Donnelly," he said. "If you were agreeable." She met his eyes. "I am agreeable," she said. "I have been agreeable since March of 1883. He made the beginning of a laugh sound and then let it go the whole way, which he did more often now than he had when they met, and the sound of it was still, after 4 years, one of the best sounds she knew. "Then we will buy the south section," he said, "and we will build something that is ours." They bought the south section in the spring of 1888. They built the ranch house over the course of a summer, with help from Cal Whitmore and his hands before they departed for California, and from James, who came from San Antonio specifically for the purpose, and from half a dozen Silver Falls residents who showed up with tools and time in the cheerful, practical way of people who repay what a community has given them. Dr. Ellison came and was worse than useless with a hammer, but kept everyone supplied with hot coffee, and the morale was net positive. The ranch house went up board by board over July and August, and by September it was done. A proper house with a kitchen and a parlor and 3 bedrooms and a porch that faced west toward the mountains. And Ruby moved in with the children and the furniture and the trunks and the medical equipment she was keeping at home now for the rides. And the last thing she hung in the new house was her mother's quilt, in the bedroom that faced east, where she could see it from the bed. John stood in the bedroom doorway and watched her hang the quilt and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your mother would have liked this. She would have liked you," Ruby said. She was very good at identifying decent people. He came into the room and put his arms around her from behind, and they stood together looking at the quilt on the wall of the house they had built on the land they had bought with everything they had. And outside, the September evening was coming on golden and cool over the Nevada Valley, and the children were audible somewhere in the house doing something that sounded both energetic and probably fine. "Are you happy?" he said. She considered the question seriously because he had asked it seriously. "Yes," she said, "in the way that is not about any particular day being perfect. In the way that is about the general condition of things being right. That is the only kind that lasts," he said. She turned in his arms to face him. "Where did you learn that?" "I learned it from not having it for a long time," he said, with the specific directness that she had loved in him since the day he said 11 riders are not me on a broken road in Nevada. And then from having it. They were still standing there when Thomas Edward came to find them, 3 years old and entirely urgent about something involving Eliza Me, and a situation with a toy that required immediate parental arbitration, and they separated and went to deal with it, because this was the actual texture of the life they had built, the profound and the ordinary existing simultaneously, and neither one canceling the other out. The Lawson Donnelly Ranch grew slowly and steadily over the following years, which was the right way for things that are meant to last to grow. John built the herd patiently, buying well and managing carefully, and by 1890 they had 150 head and 2 hired hands, and a reputation in the valley for honest dealing that was worth more than many times its weight in other currencies. Ruby continued the monthly rides until Thomas Edward was old enough to come with her, which he began doing at 8 with a seriousness about the work that delighted her, and that John said privately he did not find surprising given who his mother was. Eliza Me turned 4, and 5, and 6, and was, as the general consensus of Silver Falls had agreed from the beginning, a remarkable combination of her parents. Her mother's directness and her father's stillness, and both of their stubbornness operating in perfect coordination in one small red-haired person who was going to be, Ruby suspected, someone that the world would need to take seriously. The question of Thomas Lawson of Abilene, Kansas resolved itself in 1889 without Ruby having to do anything about it, in the form of a letter from Mr. Hendricks in Carson City informing her that her former husband had died in the winter of that year of a fever, having apparently made his way to Nevada territory at some point, and established himself in a manner that the letter described diplomatically as financially complicated. She read the letter at the kitchen table and felt the various things she had expected to feel, primarily a sadness that was not for Thomas specifically, but for the version of the future she had once believed they were building together, which had never existed but which had been real to her once, and that deserved some acknowledgement even now. She told John about the letter. He listened and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be useful, and he simply put his hand over hers on the table, and she was grateful for the silence and the hand, and for being the kind of woman who had learned to recognize both for what they were. Catherine and James visited again in 1891, and this time they brought their 2 boys, who were precisely the right ages to be allies to Thomas Edward in whatever campaigns of outdoor exploration he had been planning for months in anticipation of their arrival. Ruby watched the 4 of them disappear into the ranch land with the contented resignation of a parent who has assessed the risk level as manageable, and sat on the porch with Catherine and drank coffee and talked in the easy way they had built over years of correspondence made physical when they were in the same place. "He is different from what I expected when he wrote to me about you," Catherine said. "I expected him to have found someone he was protecting." "He was not protecting me," Ruby said. "Or not only." "No," Catherine said. "He was standing beside you, which is different." She paused. It took him a long time to understand the difference. "He understood it before I met him," Ruby said. "That was one of the first things I saw." In the summer of 1893, Ruby discovered that she was expecting again, which surprised her somewhat given that Thomas Edward was now 9 and Eliza Me was 7, and the daily arithmetic of the family had felt complete and established. She sat with the knowledge for a week before she told John, partly to be sure and partly to find the right moment, and the moment she found was an evening on the porch, the 2 of them alone, the children inside and the summer night coming down soft and warm over the valley. He was very still when she told him, in the way he was still when something was moving through him that he was not going to let out all at once. Then he said, "How do you feel about it?" "Surprised," she said, "and glad, once the surprise settled." "Yes," he said quietly, "that is exactly right." Their second son arrived in February of 1894, 10 years after Thomas Edward, and the universe had apparently decided that the Donnelly family needed the balance. They named him William James, William for John's father who had been a decent man before he died young, and James for Catherine's husband, who had become one of the most genuine friends John had. William James was, from his first days, a person of enormous calm and very definite opinions, which combination suggested that he had been paying attention on his way into the world and had already formed some conclusions. Thomas Edward, at 10, was deeply serious about the existence of the baby and took his responsibilities as eldest brother with the solemnity of a small ambassador. Eliza Me, at 8, was more interested in the mechanics of babies as a category than in this particular specimen, and had begun a series of questions to her mother about how everything worked that indicated a medical mind, and that Ruby answered with the full honesty she had always believed children deserved. The ranch was thriving. The medical practice shared with Dr. Ellison was established and sustainable. The family was complete in the way that feels not like closure but like fullness, every room inhabited, every chair occupied, every evening full of voices, and the particular noise of a household that has more life in it than quiet. John Donnelly, at 42, was the kind of man that Silver Falls held up quietly as an example, not because he had done any single spectacular thing, but because over 15 years of residence he had been consistently, reliably, and evidently what he appeared to be, which was rarer than it should have been and more valuable than most people who had it understood. He still wore his gun. He had been 50 years old in sensibility since Ruby had known him, and he wore that too. He still came home from the ranch in the evenings smelling of horse and dust, and he still washed at the pump before he came in, and Ruby still found the sound of it, the water and the familiar movements, one of the comfortable sounds of her life. She had been 24 years old, standing at the side of a Nevada trail with a broken wagon and a mule eating tumbleweed, watching the 11th rider disappear into his own indifferent distance, when a man on a gray roan had slowed and stopped and dismounted and walked toward her and said, without any preliminary, that her axle was broken clean through. She had not known, then, what kind of man he was. She had not known that he was the kind who stopped when others did not, who fixed what was broken without being asked for gratitude, who told you that your safety was your decision to make, who was in a strange town for the sake of a family not his own, who had a dark past he was honest about, and a decent future he was working toward. She had not known that he would one day be the father of her children, or the other voice in her house, or the person she told things to that she had never told anyone else. She had known only that 11 riders had passed her and he had not, and something in that simple fact had been enough to make her ask where he was headed, enough to accept when he fell in alongside her wagon on the road east, enough to take the chance that the instinct she felt was trustworthy even when her instincts had failed her before. The instinct had been right. That was the thing about good instincts. They were not infallible. They required cultivation and honest examination, and the willingness to correct them when they were wrong. But when they were right, and you had the courage to trust them, and the person they pointed you toward turned out to be real, the way John Donnelly had turned out to be real, in every room of the life you built together, on every road and in every season, in the difficult moments and the ordinary ones and all the long, ordinary, extraordinary evenings in between, the rightness of it was something that no amount of damage before it could entirely undo. On a Saturday in the summer of 1895, Ruby stood in the garden behind the ranch house with her hands in the dirt and her hair coming loose from its pins, which was its habitual Saturday condition, and watched her 3 children across the yard. Thomas Edward, 11 now, was teaching William James, 1, a lesson in the nature of fence posts that William James was listening to with his characteristic grave attention. Eliza Mee was up in the large cottonwood at the garden's edge, reading, which was also her characteristic position on Saturday afternoons, and her red hair in the leaves of the tree made Ruby think, as it always did, of something that had no name but felt like rightness. John came around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn and stopped when he saw her, the way he sometimes stopped to look at a scene before it knew he was watching, and she watched him watching his family with the face he had when he thought no one was looking, which was the most open and unguarded face she knew. She straightened from the garden and brushed the dirt from her hands. He came to where she was standing and stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the children and the summer afternoon and the valley beyond the fence, the mountains beyond that, Nevada going on and on in its enormous, indifferent, beautiful way. "Are you happy?" she said because she asked him sometimes, returning the question. He looked at the scene before them for a moment, then turned to look at her, and his expression was everything she had come to know about him in 11 years, the careful honesty, the quiet depth, the warmth that went all the way up when it came. "Yes," he said, "in the way that is not about any particular day being perfect." She smiled. He had remembered. He always remembered. "In the way that is about the general condition of things being right," she said. "Exactly right," he said, and put his arm around her, and they stood together in the summer afternoon while their children occupied the world around them, and the Nevada sky went on forever above and behind and all around, and the garden grew, and the river ran, and everything they had built together from a broken wheel on a Nevada road stood solid and full and completely, entirely theirs.